welcome to Incorruptible Massachusetts. We are here to help you understand state politics. We talk a lot about how it's so broken. We also try to cover what we could have here in Massachusetts if we fixed it. And of course, we're going to let you know how you can get involved. Today, we are very excited to cover a new report that Progressive Dems of Massachusetts put out. And it is really wonderful. Got a lot of information and we're super excited to talk about it. So I will let our lovely co-hosts introduce themselves or each other. You pick. Let's start with Jonathan.
Sorry.
Introduce Jordan.
No, it's so weird.
Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his, joining in from Boston, kind of progressive activist on kind of issue and electoral work here in Massachusetts.
Jordan Berg Powers, I use he, him, and I also work on electoral and progressive politics in Massachusetts.
Anna Callahan.
And I like the way you said that, Jonathan. That's a good summary.
Oh, Anna Callahan, she, her. Yeah, I do that stuff too, you know. Coming at you from Medford. So Medford. I sat on a plane the other day coming back from visiting my friend, and I sat right next to a guy from Medford, and he just had this perfect Medford accent. It was so much fun talking to him. It's great. Okay, so today we're talking about the new report that came out, and Jordan, you're going to give us a little overview of how this came about.
Yeah, so the Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts had been in a bunch of meetings with other folks around the legislature, but they wanted to dive in to actually create a report to understand what's happening. So they interviewed current legislators, former legislators, they interviewed current staff, former staff, they interviewed partners across the spectrum in terms of they've interviewed Republicans, right? They interviewed everybody across the political spectrum, organizations across the political spectrum, and they created a 52-page report on what is broken about our state legislature. So if you like our podcast but want to dive into some words, this is a very thoughtful, well-developed research report about all of the problems that our state legislature has and some of the ways to fix it. And I think there's something really exciting about the conclusions they came to, which mirror a lot of what's going on this podcast, which is, you know, overview, a lack of transparency, a lack of professionalism, a lack of understanding what is even happening, which is actually something we haven't really covered in this as much, but we'll talk a little bit today, which is that your elected officials don't actually know what's happening in the state legislature. In their own workplaces. So, you know, it covers all of those pieces and it tackles comparisons to other states. So I think some of the things that we lack here in Massachusetts is we tend to think like, well, this is how it works, right? Because this is what we do, because this is what we have. But they did a good job of comparing us to other states to see what do other states do, and could we take some of those things that other states do to be here. So really good report, and we definitely encourage you to read it, think about it, take pieces that you think are right for you and plug into making changes.
Yeah, and again, the sort of let's cover the executive summary, because it really is a lot of what we say on this podcast, which is the state house sucks, right? But it's specific ways in which it sucks. So, you know, they have, I think, 8 points in here. So it undermines equal representation, meaning they talk about having formal power, whether legislators, state reps have formal power to participate in the legislative process. And what that means is, do they have an actual thing that by the rules they are allowed to do that gives them power over legislation? Like, can they always vote on things? Can they, you know, affect things in different ways? Can they elect the people who chair their committees? And in our state house, there is almost no formal power to participate. So they have to rely on informal power. They have to rely on, you know, hoping to befriend the speaker's second, you know, right-hand man or whatever, like just trying to do by backroom deals and by informal means to get what they want. So it undermines equal representation because, hey, who can know whether your legislator has any actual power because they don't have the formal power to do it. And so who knows whether your legislator is able to affect policy at all. It makes it difficult to balance the interests affected by legislation. And so the ability and responsibility to ensure that all people are able to meaningfully participate outside of a few members of leadership, that is very difficult. It favors powerful connected interests, many of whom are not legislators. So it relies on closed door consultation and advantages those with power and connection. Number 4, those are 1, 2, and 3. This is 4 is it contributes to a lack of transparency. We've talked about that a ton. And we all know that we have one of the least transparent state houses in the country. I love these next two. It reduces legislative capacity and output. Because only a few people are actually involved in writing any of this policy, we can't take advantage of the 160 members of the legislature. There's really probably less than 10 that actually see all this legislation that happens. And so they have a limited capacity to produce legislation. And similarly, this is number 6, it impacts the quality of that legislation for the same reason. 7 is it enhances the House's power in interactions with the Senate and the governor because the House members have limited formal power, right? So that means that the House ends up with a quote unquote unified position, right? Because everybody has to do whatever the speaker says. And that means that it sort of has this weird outsized negotiating power with the Senate and the governor. And then the final one is that it reduces the House's responsiveness to pressures for change. So if we want something, like they don't have to do it. This whole system means that they do not have to respond to what the people want. And I just love the whole way this report is put together, the fact that they have this executive summary that makes it really clear exactly how this affects us as people who live in Massachusetts, unable to get the policies that we want, need, and deserve. So I'm going to talk about one of my very favorite pieces, favorite as in egregiously horrible, right? One of the most outrageous parts of the study, which is talking about InstaTrack. And InstaTrack is a private institution. Michael Siegel saw a business opportunity and launched InstaTrack. And the blurb from InstaTrack says, for 25 years, InstaTrack customers have had a competitive advantage when it comes to influencing the Massachusetts State House. We offer MassTrack, our flagship service, and other tools necessary to add context and clarity to the legislative process. So what you have to understand is that they allow people with enough money to get access to legislation before the legislators have access to it. Even your own state reps, they cannot know what the legislation is going to look like. But these lobbyists and think tanks that are funded by corporations and billionaires, they get to see it. They get to have closer deals and talk to the leadership about that legislation and the words that are in it. And our own state reps, they can't even see the legislation. Jonathan, take it away.
Yeah. So one thing that's striking, especially with like the InstaTrack is doing stuff that in some other, as a fee for service, like a private subscription site, that in some other legislatures, it's just public. It's just on the website. So when like one of the things they do is like bill summaries, that they have people who are writing summaries for all of those bills. But in a number of other states in the US, like they just do that. That's just something that the legislative staff does. So legislators know, the public knows, and you're not tipping the playing field in terms of access to information. The same thing with tracking, like track changes on how a bill evolves. That's something that InstaTrack can do. And in other states like California is one that comes to mind. That's just on their website. If you want to see how the bill changes, you go to their website. They tell you how it changed from each version.
I mean, you can literally get a free program off of the internet to do this for you.
Exactly.
And they cannot provide it for the people of Massachusetts.
Right. And instead, we have a situation is like, if you're trying to follow a bill and see how it changed, you have to like download PDF 1, download PDF 2.
Which you have to have access to first.
What was that?
You have to have access to those.
Yeah, you have to wait till they actually get posted. And because they won't get posted online, because it'll be like, you'll have the committee activity and maybe you know somebody on the committee, which you don't usually if you're like an average person, but maybe you know somebody on the committee and you can get access to the PDF. And then you have to compare these two PDFs, which there is really no easy way to do. And it's something that we could just be building into the process. And it's something that, and a lot of stuff with the State House, what always comes to my mind, the kind of like knowledge is power and the way in which information is a source of currency and a way of controlling, and whoever controls access to information has like an outsized influence in a system. And you see that at play in the State House, both in terms of the internal dynamics of what information you can give or deny people and how that creates a kind of a certain hierarchy, or even when it comes to the ecosystem of organizations outside of which ones kind of get a leg up because of what information that they're able to pay to get available, as opposed to what information is just made free.
Right. Unbelievable. It's pretty crazy. Jordan, we would love to hear you talk a little bit about the, they have a section in the report about diversity of elected officials. And I'd love for you to dig in a little bit with the diversity of staff.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that the legislature talks about is both, that this report talks about is both the diversity of the actual legislators that are in there. We fall far short what we should be doing in terms of representation for women, and we fall short of what we should be doing for people who are for Black and Brown folks. And I would say also, just in terms of a diversity of lived experience, there just aren't enough people who come from lived experiences that aren't upper middle class, right? So there's just also a lack of experience around LGBTQI, right? There's just a lot that the legislature needs to do to diversify in terms of who represents us. But there's also an important thing about, because the legislators can't do all this work themselves, they can't understand all the policies themselves, the people who do the most work at the State House are the legislative aides. So if you want to know who are the movers and shakers in the building, it is the young folks who are staffing these legislators. And most of your state reps only have one staff member, and most likely they are upper middle class white folks, young white folks. Why is that? Because the pay is so terrible. They pay their staff horribly. You cannot do this. You cannot do the job of working in the legislature as a legislative aide for a state rep and do that job solely and live in Boston, where the job takes place.
Where you've had to get a law degree. And you probably owe for
maybe
some sort
you
of...
don't need a law degree to be an aide, but what I would say is you definitely need a college degree, and you might have other degrees that you want to have, but you can't afford to live in the city unless you come from wealth, unless somebody is subsidizing you work there. So you get into this perverse thing where these young folks who are doing lots and lots of work, who show up to the State House even when their bosses don't, you either have to come from wealth privilege, or you're working a second and third job. And so you get what you're happening is there just aren't a lot of people of color who are able to do these jobs. And so there's a lack of diversity of staff as well that this report talks about that leads to some of the problems we have in the legislature, right? If you haven't lived the experience, if you don't know about these things, right? If you haven't suffered from trying to work through the system of direct assistance, direct cash payments, or food stamps, you don't know, poor people can tell you that the government doesn't work because they are put through endless hoops of failed government, right? The ways in which conservative thought has failed them means that they're put through endless hoops. If you come from wealth, you don't know what that's like. You're not in community with those people. You don't understand what it's like to jump through those hoops, to eat government cheese, to worry about where your next meal is going to come from. And so when you're telling your boss about a bill, what's your reference point? How are you understanding it? Right? Let alone bills that deal with people of color, let alone bills that deal with other marginalized folks, whether alone bills that deal with disability, whether that be mental or physical disabilities. We're not getting that in our state legislature because we don't have staff who meets the sort of lived experiences that they can then bring to the job to inform the work that the legislator, the bills that they're doing. So this is another piece that it talks about. It's an invisible piece, but it's part of the problem about the ways in which the legislature pays state reps a lot of money if they're in leadership, doesn't pay other state reps, and doesn't pay staff at all, unless you're really, really lucky and and your boss is in a lot of has a lot of leadership, then all of a sudden the pay goes up.
And compared to other states, we're low, way low.
Yes. And importantly, compared to living in Boston, right? Like the other piece is, you can pay people what you would pay somebody in a state that has the cost of living much lower, but we're paying based on states that have lower costs of living with one of the highest costs of livings in the country, right? So the pay is also not commensurate with where the state house is and where the job is.
Totally. As well as just tagging quickly on there, that we do have a full-time legislature, which is something that I feel like many legislators forget.
Yes.
That is a full-time job. But like, if you think of a number of states like New Hampshire, which isn't full, I forget how many months a year they work in New Hampshire. But if you have a legislature and they work a few months a year, you still need decent compensation, so it doesn't just become like the legislature isn't just a rich person's plaything. But when it's actually like the full-time job for people, you need to actually treat it that way, both in terms of responsibilities and in terms of compensation, which I think which often gets lost in that discussion, as well as even when it comes to say legislative compensation. The thing that always comes to mind as jarring is back when a few sessions ago, the legislators voted to raise their own pay and also increase the hierarchy in terms of stipends to make it even kind of, which just reinforces the centralization of power. If you get even more of a gain when you become a chair, they did nothing for their staff.
Mm-hmm. Well, what you just touched on, I think I've frozen for a second.
You frozen to demonstrate the inertia of the state.
Yes, it was absolutely for that reason. Perfect. So you touched on something that we were just about to dive into, which is the number of state reps who receive stipends and the amount that those stipends are, right? So the stipends are way higher than other states. The salary is way lower than other states. And to me, this thing about how many state reps get a stipend was just, I had to touch on this, in part because of this great conversation I had with Denise Provost way back in season 1 of this podcast. So in 1977, 9 members of the House received stipends in addition to their base pay. And the House had 240 members. That was in 1977. So in 77, they raised the number of people with stipends, so bringing it to a total of 29 people who have stipends. Let's remember that Jay Kaufman said he came out and talked about how the speaker enforces that people who are chairs have to vote the way he says, or else he takes their chairmanship away. So the number of people with stipends is kind of the number of people under the thumb of the speaker, right? So in 79, the House was reduced from 240 to 160 members. So it has fewer members now, 160, still had 29 people receiving stipends. After 1995, it grew significantly. It doesn't say exactly by how many. And then by 2015, 55 members of the majority party were entitled to stipends out of 160. In 2017, that number was increased to 83. That's a majority of the House. That's all you need to pass any policy you want. And when that happened, Denise Provost said that it was clear there would never again be dissent in the House. And of course, it has now gone up to 93. That just happened. That happened this year. 93 out of 160.
Wow. And so the reason, just to make clear for folks who don't know the math on that, it means that you have a majority of the legislature whose pay is dependent on the legislature, on the speaker. So to take on the speaker, you'd have to lose your pay, right? You'd have to lose. So who among us, right?
Often your
would lose,
staff and a bunch of other
right? I was going to say, yeah. So who among us would have a 40-50% pay cut to argue with their boss? Who among us would lose, who had staff, who had 2 to 3 staff members and an office would lose our staff, our office, and 40% pay cut to argue with their staff about an issue?
with their boss.
I mean, argue with their boss about an issue. So if you want to know who the legislature works for, that's who it works for.
It reminds me, I've often kind of just framed this as like a 2 bosses problem for the legislature, where you have one boss who can choose to hire or fire you, which is the public, and another boss that determines your pay. And it creates a very problematic set of incentives because the people who choose to hire and fire you may want you to do something entirely differently than the person who controls your pay. And most of them go along with the pay because they think it's easier at least to manage those who can hire and fire.
Totally.
I think it's important because it goes along with these other pieces, right? It's one of these broken things isn't broken by itself. It's broken in the context of, if you don't know what's happening, how are you going to know to hire or fire them? If you literally need to be a lobbyist to pay, if you need to be a lobbyist to find out what bills are passing, right? That's then like, how are you going to hire? How are constituents going to fire you? And you know, it's a self-fulfilling bubble. Exactly.
It relates very well to the idea of like not wanting to be on record on too many things in terms of votes, because it helps flatten that difference between people and it kind of immunizes them against constituent pressure because you don't have the thing to point to.
Yes,
exactly.
Go ahead.
You can go.
I was just going to say that was a thing that I felt like was sort of this undercurrent that they said a number of times, which is the state reps themselves have a variety of reasons for wanting to keep the lack of transparency, for wanting to keep things secret, because even at a minimum, it just hides from their constituents how little power they actually have and how little they're able to do anything of meaning in the state house.
Yeah, I think you were going to say exactly what I said. And so that goes into this other piece that I think is important, which is just that there isn't an independent body that looks at, looks at bills, scores them, says, here's their background, here's what they do and don't do. And it's really hard to find that information on the legislature. And I think it's important to note that Massachusetts does have an institution that does look at, that sort of is grounded in equity, but does have the ability to do that mass budget, but it's underfunded. So, the community does have a space available to it where we as a progressive community, but I would argue just a legislative, people who care about the legislature, we have a body that's interested, Mass Budget Policy Center, that's interested in doing that type of work, doing that high level work, but it's underfunded and under-resourced.
Can I take a step back for 1 second and just let people know, compared to other states provide not just better paid staff and more staff per legislator, they also provide these independent bodies that can write and interpret legislation. And in Massachusetts, there was one, it was called the Legislative Research Bureau. Then they got rid of that one. There was another one called the Legislative Services Bureau. They got rid of that one. So now there's just the mass budget. So I just wanted to put a little bit of context to say that it is unusual for a state legislature the size of our own to have so little resources for people who are supposed to be writing and interpreting laws to be able to do that job.
Yes. Yeah. And, there is an organization that can do that, but it's underfunded. It's not really appreciated, I would argue. And, I think the thing about mass budget that I'm cognizant of is that it got an executive director as a woman of color, and immediately sort of white people were like, we should create our own white man thing, because it used to have a white man running it, and now it no longer has a white man running it, and that's making us uncomfortable. So now we're going to go to a university and create another right-leaning, white man-led research arm. But we could be funding something that already does that work. But I think what's important underlying all this is, again, the lack of professionalism. But it's not just professionalism in terms of like the legislators knowing what they're doing, but also having public facing understanding of what can happen, and then the legislature being at the whims of leadership. So the legislature, if you're a regular legislator, right, your pay is dependent on the speaker, your staff is dependent on the speaker, your staff is underpaid, it's very young. It you know, they probably do a fantastic job, but they are struggling to keep up. Your information, you don't know what bills are passing because you don't have InstaTrack. So you don't know what bills are coming before you. You're dependent on the speaker to know what's in a bill because you don't know what's in the bill. You don't have time to read it because they give you a few hours to read it. So you're dependent on the speaker for your pay, for your staff to understand it, for what you're going to vote on, and for the information you need to make a decision on whether or not to vote on it is dependent on the speaker's office, or at least people in power, the ways and means, you know, those folks. That's insanity. That's an insane amount of power in one position.
Yeah. One thing I'll also just tag in on that it reminds me of is that, so one critic, often I've heard from a number of like staff and legislators that there's like a kind of like the toxic atmosphere, particularly in the House, right? And when you think about that, of when you have clear imbalances in information, the common term that we come up with for how people deal with imbalances of information I think is gossip, right? And it has a negative kind of connotation in many respects, but you're actually engineering a body where the ability to people to get information is a gossip ecosystem of them talk, like a gossip and jockeying for power, which ends up kind of leading to like the inevitable like high school drama comparisons that you'll see in terms of legislative interactions, but that is engineered into how the body works.
Oof, yuck. All right, let's round this out and cover. We've got inoculator amendments. I'll just do those super quick, and then the inoculator amendments. This is great. It's where basically somebody has an amendment and the speaker amends the amendment to say we don't have to vote on it.
They do this so often.
Phrase in there that's like, they went from a rare occurrence to being basically super commonplace. That is just.
Can we explain it for regular people what that means?
Yeah, Jonathan, do you want to?
I can do it. So typically, what happens? Let's say if you filed an amendment to do whatever. Give me a random topic. Let's say like celebrate puppies. Okay, so you have your amendment, and your amendment was to celebrate puppies, but people don't want to vote on this. The members are skittish. The leadership doesn't oppose it. So what the leadership will do is they'll go up, take your amendment, they'll make what's called a quote unquote further amendment, and say, this amendment is actually now sending to study whether we should celebrate puppies. And then you can vote on that. And you vote on, maybe you're unanimous, maybe you voice vote it, maybe you take a roll call on sending to study whether or not you should celebrate puppies.
So you're basically voting on, do we want to make this secret because we're too embarrassed about the way that we're in fact going to vote?
Exactly, because it's where people don't want to have to go on record on the thing itself because they're skittish. They often do this to sometimes to progressive amendments, often to Republican filed amendments. And rather than having the courage to just vote on them, they'd rather say like, well, we're going to dispense with the issue this way so that we give you cover so you don't have to be accused of voting against this, because we're not voting against it. We're just saying we want to send it to study, and the study just never happens.
All right, gang. Is there anything, we kind of already covered the salary and stipends compared to other states. Does anybody want to say more about that?
I think we covered it. It just largely speaks to what we were talking before about in terms of the professionalism of the body and kind of recognizing that if it's a full-time legislature, there are various institutional things about it that should reflect that.
Yeah. And you shouldn't have to kiss up to the speaker in order to get a decent pay for working full time.
You have to do your job.
Yeah, exactly. I want to close this out, if there's nothing else, with Jordan, with your sweatshirt. Policy is my love language. And I just, this is so, for me, it's Ayanna Pressley, and it's so also reminiscent of Cornel West. And I think we don't talk about love enough. Like that policy is how we love each other. Like our government is how we all get together to decide to take care of each other, to pool our resources so we can take care of each other. That's what it is. And when we let it become this horrible train wreck, it means we can't express our care and love for each other. And that makes me super sad. And that's why I think all of us are here doing what we do.
Sorry, yeah, I agree, obviously. I mean, I say this all the time. I think if somebody were to like pigeonhole a summary of like my policy positions, it's love in action. You just, we should be caring for each other. We should be having policy that lifts each other up, gives people opportunity, allows people to flourish in their fullest selves. And what's most frustrating, I think, for those of us who think about these all the time, is that we can do that. We don't need to be in the future to solve these problems. We have solutions today, right now, at this moment. And it's lack of will and legislative inertia that puts us there. And I think the thing that I always think about is, for people who are fearful, people were scared that we would cease to exist as an economic power if we let kids go to school instead of working, if we freed slaves, if we, it's not like people knew that slavery was wrong in 1760. They were complaining about it. They just liked money. And they were just like, what are we going to do? But we figured it out. Same thing when we let kids, same thing when we let women vote, same thing when we same thing when we gave equality, same thing when we, I remember I was alive when the earth was going to fall. We were going to cease to exist if we allowed LGBTQ folks to have equal access to marriage. Those were big fights when I was a kid, and so all of these, they're always wrong. Their fears are always wrong. They're just wrong about the world. They're wrong about those fears. And we can have nice things. We can treat each other nicely. We can have policy that reflects love as a policy language. So
as much as we are here dissing on the State House, we are also here to do some love mongering. Right? Other folks do fear mongering, we'll do some love mongering.
You could also even say that we want the State House to be their better selves.
Their better selves.
You could say that, like, because we all end up better off if they do.
Great. Where can people download the report? I got it because a million people were like, look at this. I'm like, I got it from like everybody was emailing me all at once. Where can you download the report?
I believe Progressive Democrats has it available. You can, I guess we'll maybe put it in the show notes, make it available for folks. So we'll certainly make it available for people.
Great. Have a great Thanksgiving, everybody. And we'll see you all on the other side.
I think this is gonna happen after Thanksgiving. It's gonna post.
Oh, you're right. Sorry, this will come out after Thanksgiving. Oh, well, scratch that.
We should do we should do a different thing.
Have a wonderful time with family, or if you don't like spending it with family, with whomever you choose to spend it with.
I love that.
Have a wonderful time with your chosen family. Ciao.